Golf was my life. I didn't want to give it up. So I went to work.
For just 9 years of age, Rory McIlroy from Hollywood was following in the steps of his golfing hero, Tiger Woods.
Oh my goodness. Oh, wow! In your life have you seen anything like that?
And hello golfers, and welcome to another episode of Making a Club Champion. I'm delighted to bring you this very special guest on this episode, and someone dear to my heart as he worked with me as a wee junior growing up and had a huge impact on my life. Dr. Brian Hemmings was the lead psychologist at England golf team for 16 years, delivering high-performance strategies with European and World Championship winning teams and individuals at men's, youth and junior level. During this time, he had helped develop the mental skills of the best young emerging English golfers, including the likes of Danny Willett, Chris Wood, Ross Fisher, Tommy Fleetwood, Tom Lewis, Eddie Pepperell, just to name a few. Brian has continued working with these players into their professional careers on various European tours. He is also the performance psychologist of the English Women's Golf Association and still works with the current LET players. Brian is the author of In the Zone, Simple Mental Skills to Improve Your Golf, and 3 books including bestseller Mental Toughness for Golf, The Mind of Winners. And Brian has gained his PhD in sports psychology from the University of Southampton in 1998 and has trained and mentored many golf psychology practitioners over the last 2 decades. We talk about the 5 commonalities and traits the best golfers he has worked with all share, and how the little things that go behind the scenes when no one is looking compound and result into someone who's playing on the European Tour or even putting on the green jacket. Thank you so much for tuning in to Making a Club Champion again, and I hope you enjoy this episode with Dr. Brian Hemmings. Dr. Brian Hemmings, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks, Chris. That sounds awfully formal, but no, good to speak to you, and nice to make contact again.
And you've worked with some of the all-time sort of current great golfers, shall we say, so the likes of Eddie Pepperell, Chris Wood, Danny Willett, Tom Lewis, Tommy Fleetwood, Gary Wolstenholme, just name a few. These sort of characters, individuals you worked with, do they share any sort of common practices or qualities? I was wondering if you perhaps touch on some of them and any examples you can give.
Yeah, well, I was lead psychologist for England Golf for probably I worked for England Golf for about 17 years and I was lead psychologist for about 15 years of that. And so I was incredibly privileged and fortunate to work with any number of, you're working with the best golfers in the country, essentially, at elite amateur level. And I think in the year 2000, England had one golfer in the world top 100, and that was Lee Westwood. And somebody actually pointed out to me, John Lupton up at Close House, he's the director of golf there, and he was on the England squad. And he pointed out to me a few years ago that, you know, if you look at the number of England players now in the top 100, it's increased about tenfold. And if you ask a lot of those golfers, and you know they've gone on to have successful professional careers, but if you ask a lot of them, I think a lot of them will say they had a great experience as amateurs with England Golf because they were at a time where there was significant additional lottery funding, and essentially they became professionals while still amateurs. Right. So they learnt their sort of professional trade while they were amateurs. They were flying around the world, playing in Australia, South Africa, all around Europe. You know, so if you go back to yesteryear, a lot of young professionals would have been finding their way. And the guys who you sort of mentioned, now they're in their mid-20s. But by the time they turned professional, they were already highly experienced players, you know, playing 12-month seasons all around the globe. So in many ways, they had a great start and a great help. And as I say, fortunate to work with a great number of them for many years. Some of those went on to, I worked with them into their professional careers. And naturally, you have closer relationships with some players more than others. But great volume of players, and really taught me a lot about sports psychology and golf as well. It wasn't one directional. I'm not a golfer myself. So the opportunity to work with really high level players also taught me a lot about the psychology of the game and what were real challenging issues. And what you learn is that it's very, and this sounds obvious and cliche, but it's a very individual approach. As each person presents with very different challenges and issues which they feel maybe a barrier to them getting to the level they want to be. And I'm sure they're still faced with those challenges now. So it's a very individual approach. But one particular area when I was involved, we worked with a South African company through a guy called Jack Retief, who was, at that point, he was the emerging player representative for Titleist Europe. And his job was to go around all Europe, obviously looking after promising players, making sure their equipment needs were met. And these were guys they obviously Titleist had an eye on for the future, that they would be the professionals in 5 to 10 years' time. And I used to get on quite well with Jack when he used to come to Woodall Spa, and we'd often talk about the psychology of the game, and it coincided with one of the national coaches still there, David Ridley. David's in his 60s now, but an enormously talented coach, worked with volumes of successful players, both in the amateur game, the professional game, and in seniors. And David had sort of said, as a national coach, I want to get to understand players better so I can work with them more closely at tournaments. And Jacques had put me onto a South African company that did some sort of profiling system, and I was kind of interested. And essentially what that did was it what called benchmark players. And what I had to do was choose, I think it was about 8 players I chose.
Was this in the England squad at the time?
Yeah, but no, there were some players that already turned pro that are still in close relationships. There was a player in the England 18s, and I chose players who were intuitively, let's say, I felt were really, really well psychologically equipped to deal with the stresses and pressures of the professional game, dealt with pressure very, very well, dealt with setbacks, worked incredibly hard, and you felt, although they were different technically, you felt psychologically these were pretty robust characters. And what they had to do was they filled in this sort of online form, and not surprisingly, what that showed was each of them were very individual. They had individual traits, better at some things than others. But interestingly, the benchmarking showed that 5 qualities they were incredibly similar on. And so I'll talk a little bit about what we found there, and then how we then use that information to try and then educate up and coming golfers in England squads, young golfers right down to under 16 level, about that these are the sorts of characteristics that players who have been successful and are successful, these are the sorts of characteristics that they show, these are the behaviours that they show, and we're trying to develop them in you and nurture you along those ways because we feel that psychologically they're important. As you might get a putting coach in, I know you've got Phil Kenyon, who's done a lot of work with living in golf, and a lot of elite professionals as well, much like you get an elite putting coach in, or technical coaches or fitness coaches, they'd look for certain characteristics which they feel, whilst there's individual variability, they'd also show certain common traits. So psychologically, we found these 5 areas, and if I go through them, I'll talk a little bit about them.
Absolutely.
The first one was that they're incredibly disciplined, and that, as I've said in so many talks before, that sounds obvious. That if you're going to get to a very high level in any sport or any career, you're going to need to be disciplined. And what I meant by that is that they often in high level golf, we're given a lot of information about training, about drills. And what you see over time behaviourally is they're easy things to miss out on a daily basis. Little exercises, Pete Cowan would call them toothbrush exercises, that you've got to make habitual. But they're often dull. They're often, no one sees you doing them. And these were the sorts of guys that would make time to do them. So going back to the hotel room, if there was a 10-minute workout to do, they'd do that 10-minute workout. They would, their day they'd make time always, wherever they were, to do those sort of bread and butter exercises. But equally, what I felt was what came across in this profiling was that they were very good at taking discipline from other people. And more often than not, they were very good at taking discipline from key people, such as coaches. So often coaches could be giving information that would inevitably lead to very, very hard work. And it might need a questioning approach in terms of a certain direction. But these players showed that they were very apt at taking discipline from other people. And again, that sounds obvious, but in my experience over 15 years, you met many players who weren't good at taking discipline from other people, who felt they knew what was best.
We had one of our first guests was Gary Smith on the show. I know you've worked with him. He's this England short game expert, and he said something very similar. He said there was a very clear quality of golfers, perhaps in the English squad or perhaps he's worked with, that actually were listening to the coaches, and I think he called it an enthusiasm for change, or enthusiasm for taking on new information, and a keenness to take that on as well.
Yeah, I think often when you get to England national level, international level, particularly as amateur, is sometimes, not by no means everybody, but sometimes it can be there's a resistance to change. They're working with new coaches, perhaps. There might be a little bit of conflict or loyalty towards a personal coach. There's lots of things that go on. But sometimes an awkward be was the question, why do I need to change? Because I'm already a high-level golfer already. I've got here through what I've got. Why would I need to change again?
Right.
And of course, there is a risk. There is a risk in change that somehow my performance might deteriorate. So, but I think Gary's right. There's an enthusiasm to, or an openness to at least consider a different way of doing something, or a modification to what they're doing in the quest to improve. And I think often in golf, I've seen over many years, people's quest to improve sometimes takes them down blind alleys.
Yeah,
and they have to revert back, or they don't realise how good it was at a certain point. But discipline, certainly in terms of we're doing very, very simple things, habitual things, but doing them very, very well, was a hallmark. And also just taking discipline from other people.
I think I just give an example on that. I remember Chris Wood sort of growing up, and he wouldn't drink sort of coffee like 2 weeks before an event. So, and he'd always be very good at sort of remember laying his clothes out on the bed the night before, exactly what he's wearing the next day. But I think there's maybe sort of two examples of those small sort of quality habits which perhaps someone else may overlook and not do. That it's all these tiny little incremental habits that sort of compound up to a large effect or result.
I do remember, I won't talk in depth about any particular player because that would be unfair on them in terms of things that may be said in confidence. But I do remember you talking about Chris there. I remember when he was in his last year as an amateur, and when he had that tremendous finish at the Open, where he finished fifth as an amateur. Yeah. I remember I was down working with some of the Gloucester guys, and Chris wanted to come across and have a session. He was preparing for the Open and said, yeah, okay. And I remember that he wanted to talk just about one shot.
Right.
And I guess if you could guess what shot he wanted to talk about. If he's just about to play in the Open, what would you say, Chris?
I'd either say the first tee shot, or I would say the 70s, the last shot coming into the 18th on the 72nd hole.
Okay. Yeah, it was the first tee shot.
Okay.
Obviously, as an amateur, you'd think probably the biggest tournament he's played in his life up to that point. And concerns, there's going to be a big crowd. It's such a big event. And without going into detail about what we did, because I think that's that important.
Yeah,
what
absolutely.
It struck me, it said something about the character of that person, about the discipline to seek out somebody who he felt was able to help him with one shot.
Yeah.
And that's very rare.
Yeah, that sort of one characteristic sort of sets a tone for everything else, doesn't it?
Yeah, I will make an hour to just talk about one shot.
Yeah. Yeah.
And most people, in my mind, would just go and hit loads and loads and loads of balls in preparation. What that person says is, this is somehow different to me, and I haven't got my head round what I'm going to do there.
So it's almost the detail
within
the discipline.
Yeah, and I'm going to take some time to seek out somebody who might be able to help me with that particular situation. I think so. Again, this is not about me and what I did. I think it says much more about
absolutely
behaviour of that player, which to me stands out.
Yeah. Those are great examples.
But moving on, I guess the second thing that came across was that they're very good at They were very good at the 5 factors. The second one was simplify. They were very good at simplifying information. So again, when you work, and as a high level golfer yourself, Chris, sometimes you can get, and the higher you go, the more equipment information there is, and of course with technology advancing. There's a lot of information to be taken in by a player or filtered through a coach. There's fitness information, training information, there's technical information. So what the profiling kind of showed of is that these people were exceptionally good at simplifying information.
I actually had this question later down the line, and it was, in a day of too much information, how can one go about simplifying all of that information and avoid overwhelm, yet increase that learning acquisition at the same time?
And I think what these players were good, as it gets you to reflect on things, is you'd see that if they were unsure, they'd just ask, I don't know what you mean by that, or how do I practically use that, or I don't understand that, can you show me instead? But what you'd see is often when people are working with players, they'll give off this information. The player might not fully understand, might only get 80% of it, especially young players. And coaches might hopefully check for understanding, psychologists as well, fitness people as well. But I think the hallmarks of these players was that they simplified it in a sense of they just asked simple questions. They do exceptionally good things, but they weren't afraid to check, because if you don't check, then that information is lost. You can't adhere to something if you don't understand it in the first place.
Right.
And so I think that was what that was revealing. And also a sense I think of is at the end of the game, they still simplified it, that it's a game. No matter what level you play at, it's a game I compete at. So yes, there might be all this complex information, and golf can be a kind of complex, there's complexity to it at a high level. But I felt these players were apt at really just, at the end of all this, is still a game. And were able to simplify it down to that. Right now, I just go and play golf.
Right.
And again, you see that, you don't see that with some players. Say you see that as, this is all about my technique.
Yeah.
And struggle then, if they're not swinging it as well, to just go and play golf.
Yeah. On the contrast to that, say if someone if perhaps someone's caught in a state of overwhelm or unfocused, how can someone sort of go back to that simplifying? What what is a task or action they can sort of reduce that overwhelm or anxiety, or and then just
Well,
go.
I guess that's it's moving slightly, because we're moving slightly away from what we're talking about. But if you were talking about managing anxiety or the overwhelm or getting over technical sense,
maybe not anxiety, but perhaps just the overwhelm.
The simplest thing to me in terms of a refocus thing and an overwhelm is trying to break that pattern of thinking and the behaviour that comes with it. And that I've never found anything more effective than a good breathing technique. And that's tried and tested over many years. So you'll get fads of new things coming in, but essentially they're all trying to achieve the same thing, and that's to lower some level of physiological arousal, to break a pattern of thinking in order to help that person better self-regulate. So in other words, they're less busy-minded, there's less thinking going on, they're calmer, and they're all more able to think more clearly about the situation in front of them or the shot in front of them.
And this breathing technique would consist of?
The one I've always felt was most effective is called ratio breathing or focus breathing, and that's breathing in through your nose to count to 4 and breathing out through your mouth to count to 7. And again, I can explain the science behind that. I can explain how the longer out breath stimulates parasympathetic activity, which and the counting part of it is breaks a pattern of often what's very clouded or negative thinking, and those things interact to get the outcome you want. I mean, it's not going to make you super calm in a sense if you're in a highly agitated state, but I sort of say, well, it will take the edge off that. It gives you a way of managing that rather than completely losing your head.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's no foolproof way. We're human beings, we're fallible human beings, but there are very simple techniques that I think a lot of the trouble is with breathing, Chris, is that people think, well, I breathe all the time. What good does that do? And the idea that there's some sort of training effect from it, that you've got to practice it somewhat to get better at it, that seems counterintuitive because I sort of breathe all the time. But what you're trying to do with people there is to teach them a breathing technique to apply when they're under stress, when their body is trying to go the other way. And there's the skill in it. And again, you see that in terms of what I said about discipline is you will see players that get that information and use it and then recognize that it helps them in those situations. And you'll get other players who will hear it and then won't act on it.
That's fantastic. I'm sure we can go into in-depth on that on perhaps another time, but I want to be respectful of your time. So the third quality, was it resilience? Resilience.
And I guess resilience is in psychology is typically another buzz. I was saying about things, we've had mental toughness, you get resilience, and they're all sort of buzzwords. And to me, when you look at the literature and you look at what they're saying, they're basically, they're reinventing stuff. There's nothing particularly new about it. And what resilience is, to me, it came out as a quality, and this is going back a few years now, but it came out as a quality. And what all that means is that basically very good at dealing with setbacks. Right. When resilience is if things aren't going well, I can hang in there, I can persevere. So typically in golf, that would be, if I'm dropping on the course, if I'm dropping shots, I see that as part of the game. I'm not happy about it, but I can deal with that. I can deal with setbacks. Off the course, if things aren't going away, the idea is that I'm resilient is in that I can keep on a path. I can persist. I think on the video on my website, one of my favourite quotes from it was actually from when I was down doing Gloucester work, and he was a very young lad. I can't remember his name. I think he was about 13, and he said, remember it really, really clearly. We were talking about a really difficult performance he'd had where he'd shot well over par, and it really emptied him. And we were trying to sort of review it and pick out at what point did he sort of start going off the rails. And he said to me something like, he said, Brian, well, I guess a setback is only a setback if you let it set you back.
Right.
And I nearly fell off my chair. there's a 13-year-old lad saying, basically reframing something.
Yeah.
There is a setback and I don't feel good, but I can determine how much this sets me back.
Right.
And that's a characteristic of resilience.
That's almost like a critical way of thinking about how he sort of totally reframed like a situation or outcome.
And that was really powerful because it's a young lad, really in his, in terms of his psychological development. They're key stages there, and he reframed it in the moment. He didn't just come out of a cliche there, I've heard this. He said that himself. Mm. Now, in terms of cognitive psychological change, that's quite a significant thing. And that's why it had a big impact on me. Mm. So resilience is something about dealing with adversity on the golf course or off the golf course. Is you see high levels of these very good players had high levels of resilience. The next one was quick-minded, and I really like the quick-minded one because quick-minded you don't need to be quick-minded in golf. It's not like football or rugby where you're making very quick decisions. It's a interactive ball sport. Golf, you've got 50 seconds to play. If you were on the clock, you've got 50 seconds to play first, second or third, you've got 40 seconds. So it doesn't require quick decision making within the game. But what quick-minded referred to is behaviourally, if people are giving information, they're very quick-minded. They act on it very quickly. And the example I typically give was, Chris, is let's say I was a fitness coach and just before lunch, I gave you a new program. Mm. Straight at the end of the day, you'd want to be in that gym, putting that program in place. Right. And you see players where, again, you'd see them a week later and they'd say, "Oh, have you started that fitness program?" "No, I haven't quite got around to it yet. The gym was closed a couple of days, and then I had this, and then and not excuses, but not in their own mind excuses. But you would start to see a difference that players would act straight away. I can remember lots of times at Woodall Spa where you'd be working with somebody, say on putting, and then they wouldn't want to go to lunch. Right. So was that urgency and need to that urgency and quick-mindedness to do this now, and not in an agitated way, just got totally absorbed in what they were doing, and wanted to act very quickly. The last one, last aspect was responsibility, and again, I think it's a bit like discipline. That sounds really obvious, but they were very good at taking responsibility for their game. So controllables. This is down to me. And I take responsibility for my actions or how much I practice. It's down to me. It's not somebody else's fault. But they were very good at what I called what the profiling showed was they were very good at looking for responsibility as well. And the only way I could the example I gave about that was, let's say in a match play situation, there was a team of 6, which was often the case for England internationals. Is if you were going out in singles, Chris, if you were a best player, where would you want to go out?
If I was their best player. Yeah, or if you felt which would be the toughest games or the most pressured, which ones do you think? You go first pair. First pair or last pair. Yeah, or last pair. So they're the really responsible positions because first you want to get off to a good start, get a point on the board. And 6, it might come down to the key match. Yeah? Yeah. So psychologically, as well as maybe best players, psychologically, they've got to be people who maybe thrive in those situations, if at best cope with it, but also want that as a challenge. Right. Sort of Colin Montgomery first in Ryder Cup or Tiger Woods at the very last end. Yeah. And so what that means in terms of looking for responsibility is if you just want your point, you wouldn't want to play first or last because they're the most difficult, because it's likely you'll be up against the other team's best players. Right. Does that make sense? Yeah, no, 100%. So in terms of likelihood, actually, you've got a fair chance of not winning your point. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But the ones who look for responsibility would see that as a challenge. So, in other words, if I went out first, I'd be up against their best player. That's a real test for me. That's a challenge. I've got to get in there. And I might not win, but you know what? If I didn't win, I haven't failed because I've tested myself.
Yeah.
And equally the same for if you were going last. Whereas I find in sometimes in match play, it's very put you in the middle numbers. I might get a more chance of winning my point, but sometimes that hasn't really tested me.
It always sounds like you've prepared for success better if you wanted to take on that responsibility, because you've done all the tiny detail work to ensure that you're capable of almost getting that point.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's this. There's stuff in the psychological literature now about what's called threat and challenge states, and that can determine something. And I guess in very simplistic ways, what you're saying is those players see situations as challenges rather than as a threat.
Mm.
So a threat is I could fail. There's consequences to this. This is going to be tough. I might not come out. Whereas a challenge state is more, well, I don't know if I'm going to succeed at this, but I'm going to give it a good go. I'm going to learn something from it.
Mm. Yeah.
And so those were the sort of 5 qualities. And then, as I said, what we tried to do then after that in subsequent years was say, well, look, if this is really some sort of psychological characteristics, what can we do as psychologists, coaches, as a way of trying to nurture some of these things in players coming through, where we see something like where somebody isn't being quick-minded, we can point that out, not in a critical way, but say, look, hallmarks of players are, if they're given this information, they tend to do this. Are you doing it?
If so, why not? Yeah.
So being proactive with it rather than, hitting somebody over the head with a stick afterwards for not doing something, it's saying that these are hallmarks there.
Yeah.
And simplifying, asking players to keep simplifying what they were doing, and giving people opportunities to take responsibility in training sessions or in practice, telling them we want them to look for responsibility. So that builds a kind of climate or a motivational climate around training, which is very much not about failure. It's very much about, let's have a go at this.
Right.
You're not here to be judged. If you come last in the skills chest, we don't care. There's still an opportunity to improve. All we want to see is you give it absolutely everything.
We had Dave Alred on a couple of weeks back, and he was very sort of big on this. And actually, you don't point out the negative behavior or habit, but you point to the good behavior or habit and just try and rework that and re-encourage that element and sort of shift the energy rather that way.
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, the years I was involved, there was a great flood of talent come through. Some of those players you mentioned earlier, where there was such rivalry between players at training and at England squads, and but it was what they called a sort of I think somebody termed it a healthy rivalry.
Right. Yeah.
So we push each other forward.
Yeah.
By competing really hard at practice with each other, we develop each other. Because I often used to say, look, you come to training, don't think that all you're going to learn is from the coaches or from a psychologist or fitness. You're going to learn from each other in how you go about it, how you push each other is as much about the learning as what you might develop technically. So in other words, you're putting the responsibility on the players as well, that they determine whether it's a successful training camp, not the coaches.
Yeah.
Everybody's in it. And if I look back very fondly at my time with England Golf. I still miss it in many ways in terms of the great relationships with the players, but particularly the coaches. They've got some fantastic coaches. But if I felt there was one thing that I was able to try and draw together was the kind of climate in which training took place. So yes, I enjoyed the individual work, and I think I'm pretty good at it. But I used to think that actually the more important work I was doing was as a psychologist trying to help the coaches create an environment where people competed with one another. They pushed themselves to get better, and that meant taking risks.
Yeah.
And with the idea, of course, is that practice develops players for what they do in tournaments. So it isn't just what you do technically, it's then you're learning the psychological skills that you also want to take to competition. And if they're in practice, then there's a great chance that those will carry over into the competitive game as well and tournaments.
I can't remember who said the quote, but it's something along the lines of you are the average of the 5 people you associate yourself with the most. So that seems very fitting for that sort of atmosphere.
Okay, good.
Okay, moving on. So how do you set goals with the people you work with, and how do you build processes around them?
Yeah, I guess you do with some. I wouldn't say with all. All I'd say is, Chris, is that about individualism is everybody is a blank page when you move them. I haven't got any necessarily preconceived ideas about what that work's going to involve,
right?
How long you might work with somebody for. You just sit down with somebody and you see where they're at. And you get some sense of them, they get some sense of you, and together you collaborate to work out, well, where am I heading, where am I trying to head towards, and where am I now? So, of course, some of that will involve some setting of some goals, but not always. For instance, you can talk to some people, actually, most of your work is about how they evaluate what they've done after they've played. Just in terms of trying to get a balanced view of this didn't go so well, but this one did. This is what I've got to work on, but I can take confidence from that, rather than just being, it's just my score or it's just my finishing position. Yes, that's information and it's results, but it's meaningless in terms of trying to help somebody keep developing. Because often they don't take the necessary information out of their performance which might help them learn quicker. So it's not always about goals, but yes, I'm no different from any other psychologist. There's a mixture of outcome goals, result goals, some performance goals. Coaches would typically see them as the statistics of on course. I don't have a set pattern for that. Often I just pick out the key ones relevant to that player in terms of what they're working on. So yesterday, for example, I was working with somebody who performs very different in match play to stroke play, performs much better in match play, and that's quite common. And we were talking about his driving and his iron play, and we posed the question about, well, because that seemed to be where the difference would lie. And so in terms of goals, all we've done for the time being is I want him to collect some data on himself, on his off the tee statistics for match play and stroke play.
Right.
Because it doesn't seem like putting or short game or approach play there's any difference, but there may be off the tee. And psychologically, what in essence what this person is saying is, I don't really let go in stroke play because I'm concerned about the consequences.
And very interesting.
But in match play I do, because it doesn't matter if I lose a hole, I lose a hole. But then he ends up playing better. So you could go down a technical route, well, my long game isn't this, and yet in some parts of the game, you say in match play, saying, I do free up, and I smash it down there, and I'm a good player.
Right.
But hasn't worked out a way psychologically of doing that in stroke play. Now you could say, well, now we'll go down a technical route, but I think that's flawed because there's clearly not a lot wrong technically if he can do it in a match play situation. So you can see there's an example there of it's not all about. I guess there's a goal set there in terms of collecting a process goal in terms of collecting some data. Ultimately, then we might try to start setting some performance goals around driving distance and accuracy in stroke play. And this idea that change doesn't happen, it isn't an event, it happens as a process. So I'm not looking for him to just click and it happen, but can it happen over a period of time?
Yeah.
And because that makes it realistic for some people. So yes, you set some goals, but by no means with everybody. It's a very bespoke approach depending on what issues somebody presents with.
Yeah, that sort of leads me on to the next question. I actually, because obviously I worked with you when I was very young and very formal memories, and I have this little notebook where I used to keep all these little notes of all the lessons from you. So this is titled 14th of December 2004. And
you make me feel very old, Chris.
Yeah, and myself. And it was sort of defining what success was. And I originally, I think, came to you and I thought success was actually not letting people down and actually sort of not winning. But actually we sort of reframed that in a way of success was giving 100%, never giving up, keeping to a routine. And those were sort of all things which I could control, I guess, opposed to what I couldn't control. So I'm just wondering sort of if that has changed how you define success.
I think that's very much still. It's interesting is, I said it's individual and bespoke, but what comes up an awful lot, and I think particularly with young players, is a fear of failure.
Yeah.
Where they're unaware, they might get anxious about a tournament or a round or a shot, and in their mind it's, I don't want to go in the bunker, and they become fearful of and trying to avoid playing in hitting certain shots rather than just trying to do what they want to try and do. And then if you trace that, help them get an insight into that. What it typically boils down to is they don't fear going in a bunker or dropping a shot. That's not the issue. It's the consequences of those things. And usually the consequences of those things go far deeper, in a sense that, well, that might mean I come in with a poor score, then I'll miss a cut, then I might not get on training anymore. And if I don't get on training, my career, my golf's going downhill. And if my golf's going downhill, then perhaps I'm not good at it enough. I might have to go and have another career. And if I have a career, well, that I don't know what I'd want to do. And it usually boils down to that rather than they're failing in some massive way, there's a core belief under that and then it becomes, I'm not a failure as a golfer, I'm a failure as a person.
Right. Nice.
And obviously they need some help in shifting that, in developing a new belief about that situation. So as I say, it's not typically that they're bothered about going in a bunker, because that's part of the game. But when it becomes excessive, it's not going in a bunker and dropping a shot. It's the consequences down the line of all those things. And of course, they could be thinking years ahead. I remember once, and this is true, this is a couple of years ago, last year, I was with an 11-year-old boy, very gifted player from London. And he said to me, we were doing something, and he said to me, I might end up in a supermarket stacking shelves.
Right. It's quite deep for 11-year-old.
Yeah, well, exactly.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, and I said, look.
So this is Andy Sullivan.
If that were to happen, it wouldn't necessarily be a failure. And the fact is, that's 5 years away at the very least.
Yeah.
But you can see that's people's minds.
Mm.
That somehow this lad had got into his mind that if this doesn't go how I want it to go, the end result after all of this will be I won't have a career in golf and I'll probably end up stacking shelves in a supermarket.
Yeah.
And to him, then, well, that's total and utter failure.
Yeah.
So you can see there that why sometimes some people get into an enormously agitated, anxious states, even though they're right out of the moment. This is October 2017. They could be talking about October 2022.
Yeah.
and people need help with that. It's a sport, it's a game, but we know, like in anything, it brings pressures, and most of those pressures are brought on by ourselves without intending to. No one goes around intending to think like that. The way our minds work is it pieces together bits of information. It tries to make the best sense of them that we can, often unconsciously, and then we arrive at, through our previous experiences and the way we're wired, we arrived at sometimes some things which aren't helpful to us, that need unpacking and reframing. And that's the for me as a psychologist, that's the you don't enjoy seeing people distressed, but that's the nature of my work, is that you tend to work with a lot of people when they're having difficulty. A lot of the work as well, I guess, is about development, about trying to make people better. But yes, it's trying to help people sometimes that get into a position where they really can't help themselves.
That makes a lot of sense. I want to be respectful of your time, Brian, because
that's all right.
Got lots of things to do. So we'll go to sort of rapid fire questions, which are many more about you and yourself. And
these were challenging, Chris, I must admit.
No worries. Okay, so you what purchases of $100 or less have most positively impacted your life? And it could be inside of golf or outside of golf.
I work in pounds and pence.
Okay, all right. Pounds and pence.
It was a really tough question, but I would say 18 months ago, I needed reading glasses.
Okay.
And they've really positively impacted my ability to read without getting overly tired. So I wrote my glasses.
Fantastic. I could join you on that one, because I've just bought some to go. Especially in the cinema. I don't know if I could ever seen a film before, but they do make a dramatic difference.
I could read things now before I couldn't read if it was too small a print. So perhaps I waited too long.
You must be long-sighted then?
I don't know. I'm from a big family, Chris. I was one of 8 children.
Oh, well.
And the opticians say that usually when you get into your 40s, that's usually a time where eyesight starts to deteriorate. And all my brothers and sisters, bar one, wear glasses. I was the third youngest. So I sort of held out a long while, but I finally succumbed, and I'm glad I've got those glasses now.
The biggest thing I put my glasses on, I look up at the moon and I can see like the detail on the moon, but without them I can't see. It just looks like one big light bulb. But anyway, the minor details. What are 1 to 3 books that have greatly influenced your life?
Right, well, this is easy. About 6 years ago I became a Christian, Chris. Okay. And so easily the Bible.
That's quite late. Well, not to give away your age, but how come you only 6 years ago?
Well, I grew up. My mother was a Roman Catholic, so I grew up going to church till I was 16. Went to Catholic schools, and then left the church. Mum said, "Make up your own minds." I have 3 daughters. They were all christened. I was married. They were baptized. in an Anglican church. I was married in an Anglican church. And then I went on an Alpha course, actually. I won't go into personal things, but I was having some difficulties in my personal life. And I went on an Alpha course, and the Alpha course is entitled The Meaning of Life. And I guess maybe at a stage in my life, I was in my early 40s, early to mid 40s. And I meant to go on this course. It was a 10-week course, and I could never go because of the way working. I thought, I'm going to go on that. And it was kind of like a pressure-free introduction to Christianity, where it was a meal and you could just ask questions. And actually, it was a very methodical way, and being kind of from a background in science for me as well, it was a very easy way. Okay, well, I understand this now, where these people are coming from. And I just decided after that to start. I sort of thought, well, I'm a Christian now. I believe I'm a Christian, and I started to go to church, and it's had a massive impact on my life. Now, much to the sense that I trained as a lay minister.
Oh, wow, fantastic!
One of my sisters was killed when I was 13, and so that had a deep effect on myself and my family. and that led me to go and train as a bereavement counsellor. So I do voluntary bereavement counselling now as well, which complements obviously my role as a psychologist.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I think that by far that was an easy one. Not the other ones weren't easy, but that one was.
Okay, fantastic. What new belief or behaviour or habit has most improved your life?
I think it's probably I've always felt I'm quite a giving person. I give a lot of my time to people. I invest a lot in my work. I care about people, and so I think probably linked to becoming a Christian as well. I felt I've been able to give even more to others, particularly people obviously in bereavement, where it's not about performance or doing something better. It's about where they're questioning the whole point of our existence. If you lose a loved one to cancer, or you lose a child, or that can make you question the whole point of what we're here for. Right. So I think the new belief, behaviour, will be something about bereavement and something about giving more to others generally. I've got a thing on my wall in front of me. If I read you it out, I think it says a lot about how I try and live my life. It says, I shall pass through this world but once. Any good, therefore, that I can do, or any kindness that I can show any human being, let me do it now. Let me not defer or neglect it, for I shall not pass this way again. And I read that every day, and I think, wherever you can, you've got to help people.
Is that a chapter from the Bible, or is it like a?
No, it was. I got it from a funeral I went to, actually, and I think it was. It's from a Quaker, I think, where it comes from originally. I don't know who the person is. I could probably look it up. But it struck me as that particular time is that, you've got to do that as much as you can. And again, that's not easy. You've got your own resources, your own limits, but wherever you can, I do try and give of myself. That's the journey I'm on.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'll find that and I'll include it in the show notes on your page. So thank you for sharing that.
That's okay.
What are bad recommendations you hear in your profession or area expertise?
That was a tough one, Chris, because I'm not obviously outwardly criticising anyone. I just think sometimes people make it out to be too simplistic. Okay. I said earlier that keep it simple. And I think, if anything, I have a gift in my field of I don't complicate things, and I can help get quite complex things. I can explain them in quite straightforward ways to coaches and players. I think that's what I've been lucky with. But I think some people make too grand a claim on how many shots you might lose by doing this program. And I think a lot of that is over the top marketing and plain untrue.
Right.
It's that you never know what your effects will be. So not one particular way of doing something, just more that unfortunately my profession is you still get a lot of charlatans out there who aren't psychologists but call themselves psychologists. Regulations got better, but there's people who make undue claims, which I think are a little bit far-fetched. So I think human beings, are quite complex in their thinking. And that's related to how their upbringing, to the way they're wired. It isn't always straightforward with people. And I think sometimes you read things and you're thinking, this is a little bit too far-fetched. It's not as easy as that.
Well, it's very sort of transparent, and that's right. On to the final one, the action challenge. So each time we ask the guest to provide an action challenge, something the listeners can do, a drill or exercise, which something you believe in at home. So fire away.
Oh, the action challenge on the bottom. Yeah, I would say saying there's not one thing, but I'm a great believer in skills challenges. I think that skills challenges in practice, embraced properly, that have real game relevance, can tell a player a lot about where their game is at. there's some measurement involved in it, as long as it's a real simulation of game-like situations where you get one ball and you get one chance and you've got a scorecard, it can give you rich information about where your game is at. And therefore, really good skills challenges done under the right conditions, I think, are fantastic at giving a player feedback about their current skills and abilities.
Is there any one in particular you can?
No, because it would depend on what areas of the game. It might be putting, it might be short game, chipping, bunker play. I would say do a range. There's some great stuff on the internet. Graham Walker, the national coach who worked with Willett for many years, he works with a host of players on tour at the moment, mainly on short game. Graham has got buckets of them. Brilliant. So if you go on Graham's website
we'll find them. I'll include them in the notes.
He does that terrifically well.
I remember one you gave me, and I've got this in my little book again. It must have been individual to me, because I probably whenever I went up to the range, I would just bash my way through all the balls. But you always told me to get the bucket and put it at the very back end of the range, and every time I'd have to walk over, grab one ball, walk to the mat, and hit it. And I remember painfully doing that for many months. But that was,
I think that would have been at the time is the idea for you, Chris. It would have been about slowing you down, and making it more like this is just one ball,
right?
Rather than I'll just drag and hit. It gets you to walk into a ball each time,
stimulate that sort of real on-life course.
Rather than all I'm doing now is adjusting my feet and adjusting my stance. Now I get it's more of a simulation. I get out of the ball, I walk to the back, I have to put it down, I have to go behind the ball again and check my alignment. So I think it was just a good habit. Hit less balls, but doing it in a more simulated way.
Fantastic, Brian. Well, this has been awesome. Where can people sort of reach out to you or find you online? Is there any social media sites or websites you're at?
I must admit, I'm not great on social media. I am on LinkedIn. I have a website, golfmind.co.uk, so anyone can contact me through that. I also have if there's coaches listening, there's a golf psychology coaching certificate. Anybody who wants to work with other players on that kind of a very simple introduction to mental skills in golf. That's been taken. I did an analysis recently. It's been taken by over in over 40 countries now.
Oh wow, fantastic!
You can see a link on the Golf Mind site. But I've met. Golf has been. I said earlier, I'm not a golfer. But and I've worked in lots of different sports, but golf's been fantastic for me in terms of the people I've met, some of the experiences I've had, the places I've been. It's really rewarded me, the game, and I still love working in it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for this, Brian. It's amazing to hear your voice again after sort of 14 years, and I cannot tell you or express how fondly my time was with you growing up. They counted for so much. 10 so all the way up to now, they were really very strong memories I had. So thank you so much for spending the time with me again today, and hopefully we'll recap again in the future. But thank you,
Chris. It's been wonderful to touch base with you again. I love the pictures you sent through from your practice folder. They really brought me back to working with you, and I just want to wish you well with this project and all you do in the future, because it's been wonderful talking to you too.
Fantastic. Okay, Brian, thank you so much.
Thanks again for listening to Making a Club Champion podcast. If you love the show, don't forget to leave a review. If you want to take immediate action on what you just learned, head over to www.makingaclubchampion.com, where you'll receive your own personal action challenges from the latest guests, all of the show notes, strategic philosophies, and much, much more. If you want even more from the show, head over to Instagram at Making a Club Champion, where you'll receive lots of golden nuggets and gems and goodies. Until next time, thanks for listening.